afternoon. It's a pleasure to moderate this session as chair. I'm Won Hyuk Lim. I'm Associate Dean at Acadia School of Public Policy. What we have as a topic for this session is improving trust in government in Korea. As you know, trust is an important topic, social capital. And when you trust some person or institution, you expect that person to do a reasonably good job in terms of competence and performance. And also, you expect that person or institution to do the right thing in terms of values. So when you trust someone or some institution, in a way, you put yourself in a vulnerable position because you expect that person or institution to behave in the right way with some performance and so on. We can bring that concept over to trust in government or confidence in government as well. As you know, since the global financial crisis, trust in government in many countries has declined quite a bit. And there has been active debate, policy-wise, as to how to improve trust in government in many countries. Chief among them is Korea. And what I'd like to do is show slides if it's ready. I can see that it's uploaded. If you look at Korea's trust in government or confidence in government, as measured by the proportion of respondents who say yes to the question, do you have confidence in your national government? Korea has shown a relatively poor performance. In the graph, the orange line is OECD average, okay? And the blue bars are Korean levels of trust. As you can see here, back in 2016, Korea's confidence in government was only 24% when the OECD average was 42%. And if you look at the overall trend since 2005, as measured in the World Gallup polls, you see that throughout the period, Korea's confidence in government levels have lagged the OECD average. And you also notice there's quite a bit of fluctuation. Okay? And if you map major events in Korea with trends in confidence in government, you could see some interesting pattern. For instance, after presidential election, Korea's trust in government tends to go up. But that effect, the change of government effect, is sort of a one-off fleeting effect. Also, confidence in government seems to be positively affected by good economic performance, effective disaster response, and negatively affected by corruption scandals and perception of the government's indifference to people's concerns. So, people who are familiar with Korea's recent history know about things like the Seoul ferry accident that led to deaths of about 300 people, most of them high school students, back in 2014. The breakout of the Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome, or MERS epidemic, in 2015, and those events seem to have affected trust in government in a negative way. Okay? And what's interesting is that these patterns seem to be in evidence in other countries as well. Okay? Here, in this slide, we have 4 OECD countries that have recorded significant improvement in trust in government in a relatively short period. The criterion is basically 20 percentage points or more in 5 years or less. So if you look at a country like Germany, you see since 2010, trust in government has improved quite steadily. Also, if you look at countries like Ireland and Portugal, 2 of the so-called gypsy countries in the middle of the global financial crisis in 2008-2009, you also see a dramatic improvement in trust in government in more recent years. Okay? Also, you have Poland, where there's a dramatic improvement in confidence in government as well. In all these countries, trust in government seems to be affected positively by change of government. Ireland in 2011, Portugal in 2016, and so on. It's also positively affected by good economic performance attributed to government policy, the case of Germany since 2011, Ireland and Portugal in more recent years. And finally, trust in government seems to be somewhat negatively affected by things like refugee crisis. Okay? Germany in 2016, for instance, when people began to feel that the government weren't paying enough attention to citizens' concerns about public safety and refugees and so on. So these patterns seem to be evidenced in OECD countries as well. If you look at some other countries like Italy, which is also one of the 5 gypsy countries, the European financial crisis of 2008-2009, unlike Portugal and Ireland, you don't have dramatic recovery in the confidence levels for government. Okay? In fact, economic performance in Italy has been quite poor. If you look at countries like Mexico, with corruption scandals, public safety concerns, and so on, you also have a declining trust in government. By contrast, in Sweden, you have fairly robust levels of trust in government. So if you look at trust in government as something that could be affected by people's expectations of performance or confidence on the one hand, and values expressed by the government, you like to figure out ways to improve trust in government by coming up with some specific actions and policy measures. Okay? And in Korea's context, Moon Jae-in government, when it took office in 2017, it launched this government innovation strategy, where one of the 3 key performance indicators was confidence in government, as is noted here. Confidence in government in 2016, as I noted, was 32nd in rank out of 35 countries. The target rank for Korea in 2022, at the end of President Moon Jae-in's term, is top 19. Okay? Likewise, there are target indicators for corruption perception index and better life index, based on the belief that at the end of the day, citizens' subjective well-being should be connected to things like corruption perception and confidence in government, which in turn are based on policy measures and actions on the part of the government in response to people's concerns. So that's what I have to set up the session. And we have 5 excellent panelists for today. From the order is somewhat changed, but to my immediate left, we have Liz McKeon from the UK Statistics Office. To her left, we have Professor Myung-Jin Lee from Korea University. To his left, we have Stefan Jacobson from OECD, and to his left, we have Professor Suni Kim from Acadia School of Public Policy. And finally, at the far left hand, we have Director General Kim Gwang-seo at the Statistics Office in Korea. To save time, I'd like to ask you to refer to the materials for their bios and so on. And without further ado, I'd like to invite Stefan first to make his presentation.
Thank you very much, Bunyuk, and thank you very much to the Korean colleagues for organizing this wonderful meeting. My name is Stefan Jacobson, and I come here from a public governance angle because we in the public governance community have been looking at the issue of trust in the context of how can governments improve their public governance outcomes. So I will, here is the structure of my presentation. The whole presentation is based on this joint project, which we will officially launch on Friday, on understanding the drivers of trust in governance institutions, which was jointly undertaken by the OECD and the Korean Development Institute after several years of close research and cooperation of the teams and strong involvement of our colleagues of the Public Governance Committee, Liz, and many others in Paris and in Seoul. So we'll look at the understanding the drivers of trust, look at the measurement approaches, look at what is the evidence from Korea and what are the opportunities for policy action. The question is, when you ask yourself, what is it about trust? Of course, you can look at the Gallup World Polls, because this is always where the journey starts with. But this is only a start, because the challenge is, how can you understand what it means? Because on the surface, it means, oh, people are happy or not happy with the government. But we wanted to distinguish between trust in government, in terms of the political leadership, from trust in public institutions. That is trust in the government as the actor in charge of collective action. And in this context, trustworthiness is a key characteristic for public institutions, and it's also a factor of well-being and a facilitator of collective action. And in fact, whereas I come from the governance community, we are here talking to a audience of people interested in measurement and statistics, and for them, the important point was to make sure that to reflect the contribution of government and institutions to the general well-being of citizens, because we know that governance matters. The question is, how can we measure it, and what is the impact, and can we make a connection to policy and policy drivers? So this is where our project comes, to create a bridge between the two and to see what influences trust. And of course, trust has an impact on the government's ability to govern without resorting to source. If you look at the European countries, the northern European countries such as Denmark, Finland, and others have long been admired for relatively low levels of regulation. And why do they need low regulations? Because they have high trust, which means we can get more compliance out of people with lighter rules, because there is stronger self-adherence to the rules. Here I have a few quotations from Francis Fukuyama from 1995, that trust means it's an efficient means of lowering transaction costs in any economic and social relationship. And one quotation from Professor Stiglitz, who I think is also around for this conference, and that says that it is trust and not money that makes the world go round. So I have already sketched out the difference between trust in the political leadership, where you may have some waves around the surface, and the deeper aspects of trust in public institutions. The question is, we are also coming here for an audience of social science researchers today, and we want to go beyond the pure perception aspects in deconstructing what this means. And from a research and a policy perspective, it can be an attitude which can be influenced by experience, and that shapes behavior. And the important point from a policy perspective is to capture the elements from trust that will influence the actual behavior of citizens. Not just their opinion on the government of the day, but the deep aspects which will have an impact on how they pay their taxes, how they behave at school, how they go to the hospitals, and so forth. And the perception means it's about a positive perception. It can be subjective perceptions in the eye of the beholder, and the confidence in the actions of the government that does the right thing and is perceived fair. And here, I would still say that perception matters, because it's not actually what the government does that matters, but how citizens are happy or perceive what the government is doing. So it's a person's belief that another person or institution will act consistently with their expectations of positive behavior. The other key element from a policy perspective is the fact that trust is often hard to win and easy to lose. The Dutch say it comes on foot but lives on a horseback, which was already, I think, the motto of the first public governance ministerial meeting in the Netherlands, like 10 or 15 years ago. And of course, Professor von Ucklin from Acadia gave you some data we at the OECD are trying to use the Gallup data with a little bit of caution, because we think the comparison of the actual levels across countries is sometimes a little bit blurry, but we also think that what is more significant is to look at differences over time. I'm trained as a statistician, so if you look at differences over time, you sort of eliminate the cross-country heterogeneity in the measurement, because you look at the same measures over time. And what you have seen is that many countries, particularly the European countries that have been badly affected by the crisis, have seen a loss of trust in government since the global financial crisis, all the countries that are in the circle. In comparison to those countries, Korea has, it was said, relatively low levels of trust, but the important point is that on a structural manner, over a 10-year period, Korea is still among those countries where there has been a slight increase in government, in trust in government institutions in general, which is also related to the fact that, I would say in general, and as an economist, Korea is still an economy that has weathered the economic and social turbulences of the world in recent decades relatively well. The country for which we have the longest national data points in terms of measurement is the United States, where we have data since the late 1950s, which have been put together by our team. And here again, if you look at the US, there has been a strong decline in trust in government, according to this Pew indicator, which is measured in the same way. And you can also see that there is a strong correlation with the economic shocks, with a fall in the 70s, and a gradual recovery in the 80s, and then a fall again with the first, I think, crash of the internet bubble, and a second fall in the late, in the recent decades. So what has the OECD done on this trust? In fact, there has been a growing realization that this erosion of trust was a key aspect of public policy in many OECD countries. And we from the governance community have launched an agenda on trust and public policy. We have this publication, which can be made available for people who are interested, which provides a sort of the framework for understanding trust. And based on this framework, we have also worked collaboratively with our colleagues in the statistics community to develop OECD guidelines on measuring trust. And Santiago, who is here with us, can also share these with you, and I think they are being presented somewhere else in this conference. And we have also, of course, developed a specific project with Acadia. So the institutional framework of the OECD has been nourished by the academic literature in public governance in the area, particularly influenced by thinkers such as Professor Bouquet from Louvain, who looks at the logic of consequences versus the logic of appropriateness, in terms of whether you look at outcomes or whether you look at the values from which the government action is based from. And from the review of this literature, we distinguish between the trust in competence, that is the ability to conform to expectations, and the trust in intentions, that is to act in good faith. And based on this trust framework of competence and values, we identify 5 components of trust in terms of their policy dimensions. The competence is related to the responsiveness and reliability of government and public services in terms of their ability to provide public services of the type that citizens want and when they need it. And reliability has to do with the response of government to disasters and also the consistency and predictability of public rules. The other aspects of values are, in a sense, pretty straightforward because it's about integrity, openness, and fairness, which everyone will understand are the sort of key aspects of public service action. So based on that, the absolute critical added value of this work with KDI is that it is a unique forward-looking survey that for the first time in the OECD has taken this framework and measured it through very sophisticated questions, not a yes, a 1 and 0 questions like the Gallup poll, but a scale from 1 to 10 designed by social scientists and researchers with the possibility to connect the trust determinants to all sorts of households' characteristics, incomes, and other aspects, which allowed us to do very sophisticated econometric work with Santiago in the team and so forth, and do good regression analysis. So there is some information on the sampling methods there for those of you who are interested. But with this level of a survey, we were able to have different kinds of questions whether these are the experience questions derived from the American thinker Rosenberg, or the so-called wallet question. If you leave your wallet on the street, do you think someone who finds it will bring it back to you? Which often for social researchers is a very good indication of actual trust, because it's the trust that you have in the behavior of others. And if you go to countries like Switzerland, usually if you leave your mobile phone or your wallet in the street, people will bring it back to you. Same thing in the Nordic countries. But for me, unfortunately for me, I'm French, and if this happens to me in Paris, there is no chance for me to ever find my wallet again. And everyone knows that. It's maybe one of your experiences when visiting Paris. So, but to be a bit more serious, there have been all sorts of questions integrated in that survey. These behavioral, experimental questions, the survey has been nourished by the best behavioral and science research, and looking at situational aspects, expectations, and experiences. So, based on the survey, we have been, for example, how did we do the questions, the actual questions in the survey related to reliability. So you remember the framework, competence, and values. Reliability is one of the competencies, and it has to do with the predictable behavior. So the question is, if you start a business today, do you think the conditions under which you operate will remain reasonably stable? In relation to disaster risk management, the question is, if a natural disaster has occurred, do you think the provision of food, shelter, and clothing will be available? So these are very concrete questions that ask people to ask them what will be their perception, whether the government will be there to help them in case something really bad happens. And I think in the annex of the book, you have all the questions from the questionnaires and people interested. And I think the data should also be made available for people who want to do secondary usage in the longer term. But I have to work with KDI maybe for interested researchers in the audience. So if we look at the data, the interesting point is that in many countries, I think Liz will, I hope will not prove me wrong, but if you go to the UK, the one service that is most trusted by the people is the police and the local authorities, because these are the institutions that people know best, from what I remember. In Korea, it's the public health system, the school system, and the civic organizations. But you will also know that once you decompose these results a bit further, people always trust the service which they have actually experienced. That means government experience with the service is usually the highest determinant of whether they actually trust it. And then people tend to distrust what is far away from them, and the sort of least trusted institutions in Korea would be the National Assembly or the members of the National Assembly. But if you ask questions in Europe, if you ask any questions to, let's say, a large-scale European country like the UK or Germany, you will see that the national government is much less trusted than the local government. And the thing that people trust less is Brussels, because Brussels is very far away and people do not understand it. So these phenomena are not unique to Korea in some sense. The trust patterns in Korea, the other important point is that if we contrast the results from the survey from the pure perception data that you have in Gallup, whereas in Gallup only 24% of Koreans trusted their government, the responses in the survey are more closer to 40% tend to agree with government is competent and 20% neutral. So the scores are anywhere between 40, 50, and 70%. So there is a clear big difference when you do these sort of situational experiences, that there is a difference between what is actually measured and what was just captured at the surface by the Gallup data. So what did we do? For those of you who have an understanding of statistics, we have done factor analysis. So factor analysis is you have a big cloud of points, is a way to reduce the heterogeneity of your sample to two main axes. And when we do the factor analysis, we found two main axes with the data that we had. The first axis was clearly related to institutional trust, and the second axis was related to political trust. And in the remainder of the book, what the team did is they analyzed each of the dimensions of institutional trust that was relevant for our framework, because here you have the results of so what we do is we take the value in terms of the institutional trust, and we regress that against a number of dimensions of trust which are policy relevant, such as the ability of civil servants to innovate, the stability of conditions for starting a business. So all the points in blue in this chart are the relevant factors which are econometrically significant using this 3,000 panel sample. And aside from interacting with a civil servant, which is the first determinant, or being part of the community, all of them can be related to some specific aspects of this trust framework. And then in the book, we take each of these aspects, we then complement the analysis with some cross-country data from the Trust Lab work, where we have data for 5 countries, and connect that with some specific policy analysis to develop a detailed policy analysis along the competencies and values. And based on this result, we can share a number of policy lessons from Korea. I cannot go in the details of all the analysis for all the chapters, but I've given you a thrust of the history behind the report. And the key conclusions are that it'd be good for Korea to define some form of a long-term national priorities beyond the 5-year political cycle. Because democracy is good, but looking at the future is also way important. If you go to some of, let's say, the best performing European countries, such as Finland, they have for a long time put emphasis on the future and defining a longer vision that spans beyond political cycles. A second aspect is to review and adjust risk management frameworks, and that was related both to the MERS and I think the ferry experience, and I will meet some of your colleagues in the National Disaster Management Institute on some of these aspects when I'm in Seoul today. A third aspect is to build public sector innovation by promoting a flexible environment coupled with an appropriate mix of skills. We know that Korea is one of the champions in the world for digital government, but innovation sometimes is a bit more than just going digital. It's about putting together some specific skills and engaging with citizens. In terms of the values, we have 3 main recommendations, which is to refine the integrity frameworks to boost the credibility and legitimacy of government institutions at the highest level. The second aspect is to move from consultation to meaningful engagement. But here, Korea is not so different from many other OECD countries, which tend to consult too late and are lacking ex-post evaluation of the regulations. So Korea is more meaningful engagement, and I think Korea is also active in the open government partnerships, means listening to citizens or getting the citizens' voice at an earlier stage and trying to have a two-way communication. It's easier said than done, but nevertheless, we put it here. And the third aspect means addressing concerns over the fairness in the distribution of the burdens, opportunities, and rewards across social groups and geographic locations. And again, Korea is not different from countries, let's say, like France or the UK, where there is a big difference between the capital city and the rest of the city. I think you have the same aspects with the metropolitan area of Seoul and some of the more remote parts of the country, but it's still, you find some of these similar aspects. So to conclude, this is a very dynamic field of research which translates into a concrete policy agenda. It's quite interesting because we have been able to have some form of dialogue with centers of government, with governance experts. Our colleague, the Canadian ambassador to the OECD, was heavily involved in leading the work at some point. Researchers, statisticians, so both from social science and people in charge of measurement, and also a dialogue with national statistical offices that help us to move the frontiers of well-being beyond. The other aspect is it's one way to address citizens' discontent, to resolve the expectation gaps, which you find in countries such as Korea, but also France. These are relatively prosperous countries, but where many citizens still feel relatively frustrated with their conditions of living, and how to enhance two-way communications with citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stefan had a lot of ground to cover, including conceptual framework, surveys, as well as policy recommendations, and he talked as fast as he could in English, but went a little bit over the allotted time. But that's okay. I think Professor Suni Kim's complimentary presentation will nicely follow up Stefan's presentation. So Suni Kim, please.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this session. I know it's getting late. Thank you very much. And I also like to thank OECD and Statistical in Korea organizing this panel for our report. We are extremely happy to have 192 pages of report will be available online from this Friday. And also we have a 3-hour session celebrating this book publication on Friday. So you are always welcome to another meeting for this research. Following Stefan's presentation, I will definitely talk about what are the implications in terms of government innovation in Korea. We started this research idea brainstorming in fall 2014, so it has been a long journey. But definitely at the time, KDI and KDI school faculty members, we thought about continuous low score on public trust in government in Korea compared to OECD member countries. So we thought about we need to find out some driving factors. What matters for enhancing citizens' trust in government in the context of Korea? When we look at the Gallup poll data or the other survey data, we realize that they always ask about perceptions on trust in government, but not much information about what factors matter. So we decided to do in-depth case study, really collecting rich data about citizens in Korea. So I loved the Oecd framework because it is based upon global literature on government performance, public policy effectiveness, how that matter for enhancing citizens' trust in government. And this is all based upon global literature. So we have 5 very important dimensions about public administration: responsiveness, reliability, integrity, openness, and fairness. And at the end, our goal of this research was finding out really some actionable policy innovation ideas. So why do we care about trust in government at that time? Absolutely, Korean community, Korean society has been changed too from the traditional public administration perspective to governance, meaning we need to understand better relation between government and civil society, government and citizen. And therefore, having better relation between government and civil society, that could influence on whatever challenges we face in our country. So we ended up listing various very huge challenges we got. As you know already, we have a huge issue about sustainability in terms of economic growth, but also social equity, aging population, and also ongoing issue about gender issue and employment issues. At the same time, we noticed several failures of government dealing crisis and risk management, disaster management. Also, this country has been working on decentralization for many years, but we are still working on what is the right model in terms of decentralization and centralization. And at the end, it is about government effectiveness. When there is a relation between politics and public administration, we have to start with the principles. What kind of relation of politics and public administration? What kind of values? Absolutely, openness, integrity, fairness has to be actively engaged in during the process of public policy. At the end, in this country, citizens got better education, and we are almost the top-ranked country of e-government. Absolutely, citizens' expectations have been increased in many ways in terms of government performance issue. And then when we look at the academics literature, practitioners' literature about what is the role of social capital and role of trust in governance. So we found that trust actually relate to concept of cooperation, especially when we have a crisis and risk management in terms of coming back to the normal life, resilience. When we have a better trust in any society and community, actually much effective way of dealing resilience. Another issue is when we have a government innovation, citizens want to join in the movement of change and innovation. Usually when we have a better trust, citizens trust in government, we can have much better in terms of dealing innovation issues with the citizens together. And also, trust data has been utilized as government performance indicator. And finally, scholars at Harvard and some other scholars in Asia, we keep talking about increased size of critical citizens in society, and it's related to education increase. At the time we started this research, we relied on Gallup poll data, and absolutely between 2006 to 2016, Korea's Gallup poll data shows that lower level of trust in government, around 26%, relatively lower than OECD average. So we thought about what we can do about this. And then I was looking for another data, whether there is really true about this perception on trust in government. Every year, Edelman Trust Barometer also collected data on trust in government for 1,000 people. And then we found a similar finding at the time period, a lower score on citizens' trust in government. So what we can do about this survey results? Absolutely, this survey, we didn't include everything, but we actually had the subjective well-being data, individual trust data, and at the end we emphasize institutional trust data. Stefan already covered these 5 dimensions. When you look at the responsiveness and reliability of competence level, the good news is a pretty good score we got on competence level, but as you can see, value level, citizens got a lower score, especially where the government listened to citizens. That score was the lowest level. So definitely citizens' expectation, government's behavior, listening to citizens actually has been really increased. That showed in their perception data on government does not much pay attention to our voice and our input. So we got around so many action recommendations in the report, but I realized that how do we implement these recommendations in reality? So I put together all the recommendations based on 5 big picture of government reforms and innovation. First, active experimentation of participatory governance for innovation and government reforms. This issue will help our citizens' feeling about getting more interaction with the government and civil servants, but also feeling of community building when we have more interaction among people in the community, and also decision-making process with government officials and stakeholders. I think this will be a great opportunity for Korean government creating different culture, not government-led everything anymore. It is about bottom-up approach, coordination approach. Another issue is definitely whether civil service government officials, whether they are really ready for innovation and change management. So we need to really think about our training programs about innovation issue, and also whether they are ready to dealing risk crisis every day. I don't think only one department can deal with risk disaster management. How much each agency should think about preparation and prevention-oriented mindset. At the end, to make action happen, it has to be a very different leadership. One example can be a very inclusive and facilitative leadership. We need to train them. Action 3, this is the most important one. Korea has been ranked #1 for openness and transparency, but it's time we need to think about what data we have. How do we utilize those data for making better decisions? And also from the agenda setting to evaluation stage, it has to be a data-oriented assessment. And also welcome stakeholders' engagement from the agenda setting to monitoring phases. This will create more feeling of openness and also fairness as well. Action 4. If I'm in consulting Korean government right now, absolutely Action 4 is significant. It could be top-ranked recommendation. Align disaster management system with the value of social equity and resilience. Collect the data about risk, disaster, and crisis by vulnerable groups, by different population, regions. It should be very important. We collect the data on it and make sure prevention ahead before something happens. And finally, without Action 5, those 4 innovation plans could be vulnerable. Citizens want high level of integrity and low, almost non-corruption in government. That's the principle citizens ask for government officials. Especially, we found that citizens want to see, make sure people who got involved in corruption at the highest level or high-level position, we want to see the process of the monitoring, but also make sure they got the rule of law applied to that behavior. Good news is we have so many innovation cases now. We will hear from UK, but absolutely OECD member countries got many stories about innovation. I think in the 1960s, 70s in this country, we learned so much from global communities. But now it's our time. We can learn more from the advanced OECD member countries. I think definitely this is a good opportunity. We can learn from other countries this time. Another issue is it continually shows that high level of perception of the anti-corruption level, and actually that positively influence on citizens' trust in government. When you look at the bottom part of the New Zealand and also some of the Denmark, Finland, Luxembourg, and I think definitely we can learn from some countries already show the high level of government officials' integrity, and I think we can learn about their real practice and journey of making that difference. And one of my friends in Finland, she told me that they are still working on it. Even they invested on enhancing integrity in government for 20 years, they are still train them to be a better leader with a high level of integrity. I'd like to end up my presentation for what's the implication for historical moment here. One of the KDI surveys showed that currently, Korean citizens' most painful memories about their life in Korea is related to financial crisis in 1997 and 1998. And then I realized, oh my goodness, even they had that kind of pain, they were volunteering for gold collection for helping out government crisis. And it was the voluntary of the women's group they started. Can you imagine this kind of citizen behavior today in 2018? We should think about this issue. But the point is, Korean citizens, they are willing to work with the people when the country got very difficult time. But also citizens are changing. Look at the impeachment peaceful demonstration history moment. What's the implication of this one? I think it's related to rule of law. Citizens want to see implementation of the rule of law in this country, even whatever high-level position. Number two, I don't think this is only about impeachment. I think citizens have a lot of issues in their heart. They want to put their voices out there. So it's really important. It's time we really need to think about, listen to citizens' voice and heart, and ready for respond to their needs. The good news is several data shows that last year, October 2017, this is the 1,000 people data collected in 2017 time period is October and November. Actually, citizens' trust in government has been increased. How do I interpret this data? Absolutely expectation. When we have a new leadership, citizens really want to have hope for making better. So this really reflects citizens' expectation about President Moon Jae-in administration's leadership. And I think if you look at the innovation plan for current government, I think they take the right direction. Now it's time to implement, getting tangible results for citizens. So thank you so much for your attention.
Stefan and Sunhee gave presentations on the OECD Trust Framework and also highlighted the results of the case study in Korea. And now I'll turn to Liz McKeon, who will make a presentation on the UK case.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you very much to our hosts for inviting me. I followed this work for some time. First in my previous role as Chief Economist of the UK Cabinet Office, where I was also the UK representative on the OECD Public Governance Committee that Stefan has already referred to. I followed this work there from a governance point of view. In the summer, I moved roles. I'm now the Director of Public Policy Analysis at the ONS, our Office of National Statistics. And so now I'm thinking about the same issues, this time from a measurement perspective, but also thinking more broadly about the role of national statistical institutes and actually beyond that, evidence and analysis in this agenda. So, given that, I'm going to talk today about 4 aspects. The measurement challenges, the OECD framework itself, its application to Korea, the broader role of evidence-based policy making, and linked to that the role of improving competence in statistics. In each case, I'll draw out a UK example. I'll do this briefly, but happy to follow up in the discussions that follow. So I think our speakers so far have already indicated the importance of trust, or rather how strengthening it can lead to a range of benefits for public institutions. They've also highlighted the measurement issues that have plagued this topic. So I think we are really pleased that the OECD has looked into this as thoroughly as it has, culminating in last year's OECD guidelines on measurement trust. And in the UK, we were very glad to contribute to that work as members of the advisory group. It's an area where undoubtedly there's more to do, but there's a key role for national statistics institutes to help this, working with other partners. And I think in that context, it's really fascinating to see the work that's been done in Korea. It's going to be published on Friday to measure so many different types of trust in one instrument. And we're looking forward to having a closer look at that work once published. In the UK, the ONS does report on various aspects of trust. We do that in our Social Capital in the UK publication. The last edition was in May 2017. And when we think about social capital, we think about 4 dimensions, or 4 domains. Personal relationships, social support networks, civic engagement, and trust and cooperative norms. And it's that 4th domain of trust and cooperative norms where the sort of issues of trust that we're talking about today feature. And here is just some of the results from that 2017 publication. This data comes from a variety of different surveys, including the Eurobarometer, European Social Survey, Crime Survey, the Community Life Survey, and we've run it together in this report, which is available online if you're interested in seeing some more of the detail there. So, moving on to the broader OECD work. Stefan's already taken us through the detail of this framework. I think it was interesting to see it developed and interesting to see it really being aimed at supporting actionable policy insights, which look at both competence and values. And then it was interesting to see how the Korea case study drew recommendations into both of those dimensions. And some of those also have resonance in the UK context. So in the interest of sharing some of our learnings from the UK with you all today, I wanted to look at one of those recommendations, the recommendation on building public sector innovation capacity, which I understand in the Korean context builds on your government innovation master plan, which we've also looked at with interest in the UK. And I just want to give some insights from the UK and what we found looking at public sector innovation. So in the UK, we have a lot of teams in government who provide a specialist innovation capacity. And these teams, which are the logos of which are on this slide, some of which may be familiar, some less so. I'm not going to go through them all. Most of these teams have a web presence where you can find out much more detail of their work. Let me just draw on a couple. Policy Lab, that's a creative space at the centre of government which encourages policy teams across government to try new tools and techniques, especially techniques which involve data, digital or design bias. The Behavioural Insights team, which you may already be aware of, providing work on behavioural insights. And the Government Digital Service, GDS, likewise does what it says on the tin. Perhaps it's less clear what the Open Innovation Team is. That's a relatively new team in the centre of government in the UK, which is very focused on bringing academic expertise into bear at an early stage of policy making. So, I say on this slide that they're the future policy network in the UK. What do I mean by that? Well, we have all these teams which offer an innovation capacity, and we've had a number of them for some time. What we did by forming the Future Policy Network was bring those organisations together. They're teams that share common objectives, and by bringing them together, we not only allow them to network with each other, but we allow a coordinated approach. Why might that be important? I think too often in innovation we found in the past that these teams were doing great work, but were they always doing it on the highest policy priorities for our country? Sometimes not. And what we do by having the Future Policy Network, alongside another innovation, a commissioning board, is to bring together those teams with innovation capacity with commissioners, ministers, our Prime Minister's office, the Cabinet Secretary, to see whether the cross-cutting priorities we face in the UK have got the right support from these innovation teams. And that's been an important part of the innovation journey in the UK. A second part, which is important and relates to the recommendation for career in the report, is about building capability. All those Future Policy Network teams have a capability building part to them. But we also thought that an important part in the UK context was that all civil servants had a shared understanding of what we mean by innovation. And to help do that, all of our talent programmes have modules in them on innovation, and our talent programmes across government. So rather than being focused in one department, across government, our leaders are now beginning to talk about innovation in the same way and learning about the different capacities that these teams can offer. So that's just an insight. I could say much more about all of this, but that's just an insight into what we are doing in public sector innovation in the UK, and hopefully is of interest as you think about that in the Korean context. Now let me turn to evidence-based policy making. And much like how in public sector innovation we have an ecosystem of different things working to improve innovation, it's much the same with the evidence-based policy making. Recently, in the UK government, we formed the analysis function. This function has a vision of integrating analysis into decision-making and delivery to help improve outcomes. It draws on the years of experience of individual professions within the UK civil service, be they the Government Economic Service, the Government Social Research Service, the Government Statistical Service, and so on, and bring those different professions together to form the analysis function. We've launched a strategy recently, which you may be interested in, again is available online. Also going to look at some other parts of the evidence-based policy making ecosystem in the UK. That of the what work centres and the trial advice panel. So, in 2014, we came up with the idea of a What Works network that would pull that would put high-quality evidence in the hands of decision makers. These What Works centres, which are on the slide you can see now, are independent of government. They have a focus on high-quality evidence synthesis and studies. Crucially, they translate those assessments into practical guidance. And they build capability of decision makers to make use of evidence. We now have 11 centres, and as you can see from the slide, they cover policy areas worth over £200 billion of public expenditure. We also have developments in government, and you can see now, this is a report that we published recently on the rise of experimental government, and in particular, an innovation that we've had in the UK is the trial advice panel. What we wanted to do here was make it easy for policymakers to launch new experiments and trials in government. Sometimes policymakers could be put off because they lack the capability or the capacity themselves to run such trials. The trial advice panel puts them in contact with academics and experts within government who can help support them in the whole process of trial from design through to evaluation. We have now had 18 different departments and public bodies making use of the trial advice panel on 54 different projects, and an idea of those is in the reports, which is also available if you're interested in more detail. So I'm going to skip this next slide, which gives some examples of what works trials that have taken place, and move to improving confidence in statistics. So when we think about improving confidence in statistics in the UK, we think about factors in three different sets. Structural factors, where organisational independence has been absolutely key. Statistical factors, where we focus on sound statistical processes around quality outputs. And reputational factors, where we focus on good communication with stakeholders and challenging the misuse of statistics. What I've also listed on the slide is some of the particular features of those factors for each one. I'll just pull out a couple. Under structural factors, independence has been absolutely key. Our Office of National Statistics is an executive agency of the UK Statistics Authority, established on the 1st of April 2008 as part of the Statistics and Registration Services Act. It's an independent body operating at arm's length from government, and it reports directly to Parliament, not to any minister. This independence has led to a substantial increase in trust, and it has also led to an increase in people believing that our statistics are free from independence. It's been a very important step for us. I'll pull out from the reputational factor as ethics. We've established an independent ethics committee, the National Statistics Data Ethics Committee, to provide transparent ethical advice to the National Statistician on the use of data for research and statistical purposes. As we increasingly use big data and linked data, having an independent view on ethical concerns becomes ever more important. Finally, to pick out a factor from the middle of the statistical factors, relevance, I wanted to give an example of some recent work. This was work produced by the Office of National Statistics on young people. Why do I think this is a good example of relevance? First, it was a cross-cutting topic. It cut across a number of topics that we normally look at within the statistical office, and was of intense interest to policymakers. Second, the analysis that we undertook exploited our ability to link data to draw new insights, and in some of the analysis we used administrative data and survey data and mixed that together to give insights that hadn't been possible before. We also had a big focus on communications. We wanted to tell a narrative with our statistics. For example, one of the articles that we published on this work was called Being 18 in 2018, and saw how the life of an 18-year-old now in 2018 had changed from the 18-year-olds at the millennium. And that was a very popular piece that appealed to people because it told a story rather than just the statistics. We also used new approaches to communications. For example, and you can see this on the slide, we produced a calculator so that young people could find out how their financial situation compared with their peers. And then finally, and you can see the photo there, we held a forum where we presented some of our work and drew in other external parties to present their work. Crucially and interestingly, we finished that session with a panel of young people commenting on what they'd heard that day and whether the statistics that we had produced on young people had any relevance or resonance with young people today. And they were a challenging panel, and it gave us some useful feedback for the future. So that's just an example on the relevance side. I'm going to conclude there. I'd just like to say I think trust is an incredibly important area. It's one where we need to continue to build the evidence base and overcome some of the challenges that we've already mentioned. But I think because of that, it's an area which really lends itself to international learning. That's why I'm very pleased to come here today to talk about the UK experience, but also to hear about the Korean experience, which I can take back home. Thank you.
Liz talked about some issues, statistical issues dealing with trust, but then she emphasized evidence-based policymaking based on experiments and networks of policymakers with academics and so on. Another key instrument in this policy formulation is deliberative polling, and we have Professor Myung-Jin Lee from Korea University to make a presentation on that topic.
Good afternoon. My name is Myung-Jin Lee from Korea University. It is my honor as well as pleasure to talk about deliberate opinion and civil participation. Today I would like to share our recent experience of the deliberative democracy and related issues. And for my presentation, I will cover the following 4 sections. The first one is the introduction, some historical background for deliberate opinion or democracy. And the second one is the explanation and the feature of the deliberate opinion. And third one, civility and the civil capacity. And in this particular section, I'd like to talk about detailed process of the deliberate opinion using the recent hour experience. And finally, I will mention the issues for the more fruitful result of the deliberate opinion in the future. Introduction. And the familiar graph from Gallup poll. And as you can see, it is well known that the trust in government is not so high in many countries, of course, including Korea. And in particular, Korea shows relatively lower level of the trust in government. This one is the Korean statistic, and this one is the average of OECD country. And another graph shows the evaluation of public institution, including government, in terms of the competence and the morality. And they're using 5-point scale, Likert scale, the evaluation of the public, most of public institution, around the average, that is 3. And according to many research, there have been great improvement of the government in terms of the efficiency in many countries. But how come we have such a lower level of the trust in the government and the decreasing trend of the trust in government? And there could be several reasons for that. One would be the crisis of democracy or representative system in many countries. And there's a criticism against the current system, that is representative democracy, saying that the democracy failed to mediate the relationship between civil society and the government. And in addition, there have been there may be some kind of the special situation in Korean society, and due to rapid development and historical experience, we have too much the power of the government and the market, the group of the larger corporation. By contrast, the civil society is not fully developed in Korean society. So what is missing is the sense of participation and the experience of citizen, and that is the feeling of the being a part of the decision process, and what could determine their life. So I would like to use that kind of theoretical foundation to explain the reason why we need the deliberate opinion or deliberate democracy. And anyway, that such experience I believe to partially result in the lower level of the civil participation and the civility and the trust in government. And so in that sense, the government, the deliberate democracy is the one way to promote the civil participation in the process of the decision making. And it is believed that the deliberate democracy stress not only binding preference of the public, but also authentic deliberation and promoting the sense of the legitimation and the social trust. there is no concrete definition of the deliberate the democracy as well as deliberate opinion yet, but it will be more easier if we compare public opinion and deliberate opinion. And why public opinion is simply based on the public polling, to have the view of the majority. The deliberate opinion is formed through the public discussion and argumentation. Time limit, some more, the PowerPoint slide. And there are two types of the collecting deliberate opinion. The first one is the deliberate polling. In this type of the polling, the issue is somehow fixed and participate to decide the result through deliberate process. By contrast, the second one is the deliberative participative survey. In this type of the polling, participate or interest group make the issues of the deliberation, and there is some way to reflect the opinion of the general population as well. And recently, we have two important examples of the deliberate democracy, both are somehow related to presidential election pledge. The first one is the public deliberation of the nuclear reactor in 2017. The second one is the public deliberation of the admission system in 2018. Thank you. And both are believed to the example of the participatory public making and the new model of the conflict resolutions. And in addition, the evaluation of the both deliberation are somewhat positive. And most participants are satisfied with the small discussion as well as the deliberate process. And despite all kind of shortcoming, limitation and everything, at least the government finally decided the policy relating to the nuclear reactor as well as the university administration system. And discussion. I don't think the recent experience of the deliberate democracy could be the final solution to promote the civil participation and trust in the government. And I would like to mention some point for better research result, with the result of the public deliberation in the future. The first one is the neutrality and impartiality. And the deliberation process should be organized by a neutral committee member. And we have the past experience, and some people argue that the committee should consist of the interest group, the people from interest group, well, even the people from political party. And however, I guess the such committee member could cause unnecessary conflict during deliberation process. And the second one, in the consensus building effort, if possible, even the issue and the process of deliberation should be formed, by participatory or interest group. And in addition, there should be some kind of the way to reflect the opinion of the general public. And the third one, of course, the deliberation need open and transparent communication. All procedure of the deliberation process need an open discussion. And finally, the fourth one, civility and the public acceptance. The public deliberation needs the various types of the strategy to promote the awareness and the acceptance from among the citizens. And in addition, it is necessary to promote the civility in general. And without that kind of the enough level of the civility And even this kind of the deliberated democracy would be some kind of the superficial way of the government policy. And I guess that is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Deliberative polling or deliberative participation survey is an attempt, if you will, on part of the government to improve openness in the OECD trust framework. And as Professor Lee highlighted, there are some important issues that we have to deal with going forward, including whether it's right to outsource policymaking, if you will, to citizens, and what kinds of topics should be selected for deliberative polling or participation survey, and so on. Thank you very much for the presentation. Now we have a discussion comment by Director General Kim.
Thank you, Professor. My name is Kwang-Sup Kim, Director General of the Statistics Policy Bureau in Statistics Korea. I'm so happy to be here for sharing ideas on trust in government. The topic of this session is improving trust in government in Korea, and I'm going to talk about statistical issues rather than the policy aspects covered by the presentations. Out of the 4 presentations in this session, the first one was introduction of the OECD framework for measuring trust in institutions, and I will briefly comment on other 3 presentations. Firstly, I would like to comment on fostering institutional trust in Korea presented by the Professor Kim. Public trust is needed to ensure the legitimacy of a government in a democratic system, and accordingly, any government will try to gain more trust. Without a credible measurement of the public trust, it is impossible to evaluate how much a government has achieved and how much more effort is required. To enhance trust in institutions, Professor Kim presented 5 actions based on data from Gallup World Poll and OECD Acadia Trust Survey. And I would like to focus on the data source, mainly Gallup World Poll data, which is used for producing BLI. This is because reliable statistics are needed to measure the level of well-being and whether there has been any changes after implementation of actions. Collecting data based on relatively simple survey questionnaire and method seems to be a reasonable choice for international comparison. However, in order to obtain the information necessary to create policies that enhance public trust and take Korea's special characteristics into account, it is better to use official statistics whose reliability is guaranteed by governments. That is very essential to make the evaluation of policy outcomes more credible. In this regard, I would like to mention some points from a statistical standpoint. First, according to the Confidence in National Governments published by the OECD, the level of confidence in the Korean government has risen sharply from 23% in 2012 to 34% in 2014, but declined substantially back to 24% in 2016. On the other hand, the average in OECD countries remained stable at around 40 to 45%. Although the figures for Korea may simply be the result of what was taking place in the country at the time, it is better for us to understand these changes by providing appropriate data. Let me suggest different results from other surveys. According to the Social Integration Survey, which examines trust in the government, the level of trust in the government between 2013 and 2014 was unchanged. And there was a 10% decline between 2014 and 2016, which is significantly different from the OECD survey results. Of course, the Social Integration Survey may not be 100% accurate. Therefore, it is needed to conduct a detailed analysis on why the results from different sources show considerable discrepancy for future use. I will now move on to talk about the deliberated opinion and the civil participation presented by the Professor Lee. This is before the Director Mackion's presentation. As mentioned in the presentation, the deliberative polling implemented recently provides an important opportunity to recognize the importance of statistics, both inside and outside the government. As stated, gathering public opinion is one of the useful way to solve social conflicts that arise from policy implementation. To gather public opinion on an issue successfully, the survey respondents must be representative of the population and the deliberation must be substantive. Statistics play an important role in determining the representativeness of respondents and leading constructive and reasonable deliberation. In other words, it is very meaningful that the recent public opinion surveys in Korea used stratified double sampling and presented various statistical data to respondents in order to encourage reasonable decision making. And that is quite impressive compared to the other public opinion polls or surveys conducted as part of the policy making process. Please let me share 3 improvements that can be made from a statistical point of view in order to obtain more rational and democratic conclusions. First, sufficient discussion and research is required on defining the statistical population. It is necessary to identify the population which is interested in an issue. It is also important to obtain consent from groups that are excluded from the discussion. Second, because the sample size cannot be expanded indefinitely due to time and budget constraints, research on sample design methods should be developed in the future. In particular, survey management issues such as the response rate and non-sampling error should be handled more strictly. Third, the data provided to respondents must be statistically reliable in order to have reasonable results. In other words, the results of public opinion polls can be credible if official statistics or data verified by the organization with authority is used. I will now move on to presentation made by Director Mackion. As noted in the presentation, some examples are suggested as evidence-based policymaking, and I think institutionalization is important to get better outcome. In 2007, Korea has introduced a system titled Evaluation for Statistics-Based Policymaking under the Statistics Act. The core of the system is that when the government makes a new law or revises an existing law to implement a new policy, it is required to present statistical indicators that can measure the performance of the policy. The indicators may be suggested from the existing statistics, but if there are no appropriate statistics, a new development plan has to be provided. Since 2008, Statistics Korea has assessed over 3,000 laws and recommended 412 statistical developments and improvements as of 2017. Government agencies are obliged to comply with the system because there is a provision in the Statistics Act, and also the Ministry of Government Legislation stipulated such a policy as a procedure that must be followed by government agencies. This system is important not only for evidence-based policymaking by linking policies with statistics, but also for enabling quantitative evaluation of policies by analyzing changes in statistical figures. Although this system is limited by the fact that policy outcomes cannot always be quantitatively evaluated, it has made a significant contribution to make policy decisions based on evidence. However, one of the problems arising within the system is that COSTAT needs to fully understand each policy to properly evaluate it, but enough time is not given for evaluating during the legislative process. COSTAT has tried to solve the problem through consultation with the experts, but there is a long way to go. I hope that this experience will be helpful to OECD member states and other countries that are seeking to build a system of governance for evidence-based policy. And also, COSTAT needs to learn from the experiences of other countries for further development of system Therefore, it is worth considering the creation of some kind of working group for developing of such a system. About 150 years ago, Abraham Lincoln spoke of a government of the people, by the people, and for the people in the Gettysburg Address. I think the role of national statistics is very important in building such a government. That is, the role of government is directly related to the quality and the quantity of public services. Reliable statistics can tell us what kind of public services are being needed by people and whether the government meets the needs or not. After the government identifies the public services and that people want and provides them with sufficient quality and quantity, then I think it is possible to create a government that is described in the President Lincoln's address. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. There were a lot of interesting and useful comments. I'd like to ask Stefan and Sunhee to respond to DG Kim's comments on the difficulty of international comparison given country-fixed effects and various statistics of reliable quality. So Stefan or Sunhee, would you like to?
I would just say that from my personal perspective, I would not compare too much the levels across countries. I think what can be compared across countries is the difference. I was also trained as a statistician, so it's an issue of differences in differences. So by doing differences in differences, you can compare change, and comparing the change is what matters. However, on a single country level, you can measure levels and relate them to policy factors, do the kind of policy analysis that was done with KDI. That's what I would say. And of course, I think from what I understand of current statistical trends, increasingly, it becomes cheaper to generate data out of administrative processes than out of surveys. So as much as possible, it's very important to make sure that statistical requirements are included at the start when policies are being designed so that it makes it easier to evaluate them. It will not replace the need for surveys and for having the subjective perceptions for citizens, but it's a great advantage that we can take of the recent digital and systems development within governments. That's what I would say. As the last point is the trust in statistics. As was mentioned by Liz McKeown, I think it's not only a technical question, it's also an issue of the perceived independence of statistical offices and their capacity to publish the data that is right at the right moment.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much for very good comments. If our research affects statistics in Korea's interest in getting more data on citizens' trust in government, I'll be so happy. And thank you for your attention on this subject. Absolutely, the OECD relied on Gallup poll data. The scale of response is yes and no about trust in government. Our research criticized that approach. We developed a different scale of the response regarding citizen trust in government. And definitely this time we relied on how much citizens have a confidence in specific public institutions in the way of the institution cares about interest of society. So this time we really look at specific dimension of public institutions' contribution to taking care of the interest of society as a whole. And also we asked all the public institutions, how citizens perceive differently in terms of their trust in government. I think that's a very important step. We are moving forward from the Gallup poll approach. And we criticize OECD comparing country data basis on that kind of a poor Gallup poll survey data. That's reason this in-depth case study really showed that we need to have a very solid measurement of asking citizens regarding their confidence in government institutions. The good news is OECD actually published guidelines and recommendation about how to measure citizens' trust in government, and that report published in 2017. I really hope I was part of that advisory board member for that report, and many countries' statistics, they are asking for one solid measurement, how to use that question for their annual survey of citizen census data. I think Korea can adopt this question to annual survey of some census and actually measure the long-term history about citizens' trust in government, because annual census data really shows many other individual well-being issues and also social economic issues. So we can actually find out from the statistic annual survey data for finding out what factors really matter for enhancing citizen trust in government. Another issue about comparative among study on different countries, and absolutely, I think in this report we actually included 6 countries' comparative data we participated. It turns out that still Korea has a weak capacity on value dimensions, and also younger generations, their trust in government is much lower than older generations. And so we realized that we really need to find out comparative data as well if we want to really understand what context matter in terms of understanding citizens' lives. Just looking at in-depth country case study is a very rich data, so we can utilize it. However, we also need to open up comparative data to have a better understanding about what's going on at the global level and what's the citizens' life in Korea compared to other countries. So absolutely, research funding should go to in-depth case study of a country study, but also we need to encourage comparative data among countries. So thank you so much.
Okay. On evidence-based policymaking, DG Kim talked about the mandated inclusion of statistical indicators. Liz, could you relate some examples from the UK, relevant examples if there are any, or would you like to add some comments on that issue? He mentioned the mandated inclusion of statistical indicators for...
Yes, thank you so much. That was very interesting to hear the system that you have incorporated. And I think when we're trying to think about how you improve evidence-based policy making, I often think of it as how do you create greater demand for evidence and how do you improve the supply of it. And I think that sort of form of mandation absolutely goes to the demand side, and it will be and it's interesting to see it's already having an effect. And it sounds like it's actually now created a supply side problem of how do you create the right evidence in return, which is quite interesting and suggests that there's kind of, by having created the demand, you have to continue to shape the capacity within the organisation to meet it. So very, very interesting system there. And I think it's interesting how mandation in different forms in evidence-based policy making seems to be on the increase from different examples from around the world that I see. I think recently seeing in Canada a mandation for experimentation and program budgets has been introduced, which is a variant on the mandation for statistical indicators that we've seen here, but it's a similar kind of idea about actually how can we force something in the process that makes this just part of doing business. And I think it's interesting to see those sort of indications, and be good to know more about some of the challenges faced, but also the good results that have happened there.
Professor Lee, DG Kim talked about the use of statistics to make sure make sure that the sample is representative of the population, evidence is reliable, and so on. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, thank you for brilliant comment, Director Kim. And he's quite right in pointing out the problem of the sampling, as well as the data of which came from deliberative the poll. And yes, we need a guideline. Actually, we did not have any, the strict sense, the guideline or regulation for deliberate polling. And without that kind of preparation, we took the list of the mobile users, the designing some kind of the special survey, including the question of the election or the party affiliation, something like that. So we kind of violate the spirit of the law of the election. So if the government, choose to pursue the deliberate democracy in the future, I guess the government should establish some kind of the guideline or regulation or even role of the deliberate polling. Thank you.
Well, I don't want to stand between you and dinner, but dinner is not served until 7, and we started about 7 minutes late, and I want to make this session somewhat more inclusive. So for the last 5 minutes or so, I'd like to invite maybe 2 or 3 questions from the floor and give panelists a chance to respond to those questions. So if you could identify yourself and ask a brief question, I'll appreciate it.
네, 좋은 말씀 좀 많이 들었습니다. 네, 오늘 그 참여 전문가들 중에 독일 분이 한 분도 안 계시고 독일의 체제에 대해서는 그 이야기가 없는 것 같아요. 네, 그것은 어찌 그렇게 되었는지 좀 알 수 있을까요?
Any other question? Way over there, in the back.
Hello, I'm Isabel Schmidt from Statistics South Africa. I know that there's a move on the way to include measurement of trust in SDG 16. My question is, how has the OECD positioned itself in order to promote the guidelines that you've put through together to actually become the guidelines for international comparative purposes?
Well, one last question. Anybody? Okay, the first question had to do with non-inclusion of Germans on the panel. I know we have commissioners from Switzerland and Austria, but I don't know why no German participant is here. So if anybody has an idea about, Stefan.
I would say that Germany has participated in the Trust Lab. So if you see the full book that is available, that my colleague Santiago can give you or give you later, you will see that Germany is presented in the so-called Trust Lab results, where we have results for Korea, Slovenia, Germany, the United States, and a few other countries. However, not all countries have committed to such an extensive study on trust in government as KBI. This is really a big commitment. But if you look at social science, I'm sure you would find some social science researchers looking at trust in government in Germany in general. But that's all. I cannot comment for the choices of the German government.
The last question about SDG 16 from our South African colleague. Or Suni, would you like to respond to the German question?
Sure. I wanted to actually invite Santiago regarding the second question, but regarding the first question, thank you so much. Actually, we included German survey data, part of our report data analysis, and I was part of the comparative study. It is so interesting to study Germany because Germany actually have pretty good records of improving their trust in government. And then the data shows that German citizens' trust in government has been really increased, but also citizens' perception about responsiveness, reliability, and values of integrity and openness, fairness actually got pretty good score among 6 countries we compared. So definitely I think if Germany can do the in-depth case study like us, it will be so insightful for informative information actually we can get from Germany case. So I think definitely we have some data on Germany in the report, but in terms of driving factors of Germany's case, we don't have a clear explanation. But they got a pretty good score on both competence and also values. So I'd like to invite Santiago regarding the second.
So I introduce myself. I am Santiago Gonzalez. I work at the Oecd. I have been working in this report jointly with KDI researchers and Stefan. So just some precision on this goal 16. There is another process that is ongoing, that is to develop a handbook on governance statistics. This is led by the National Statistical Office of Cape Verde. And within this handbook, there are leading institutions that will take the responsibility of on a participatory way draft each of the chapters, and the chapter of trust will be under the responsibility of the OECD. And ideally, this is a handbook that will be released in, let's say, 12 to 18 months, and will go in parallel with the SDG 16 process. So there is an aim that through this process, we could inform the goal 16 measurement process, and trust will be taken by SDG 16 measurement as an official indicator. So this is a parallel stream of work in which the OECD is also involved.
Thank you very much, Santiago. Thank you very much for your attention for the past hour and a half. I hope we have contributed to an enhanced understanding of what drives trust in government and the importance of evidence-based policymaking and deliberative polling. So thank you very much, and we are now free to go. Thank you.